Thin snow, light tracks, a 75 mm crack. What seems minor turns into the worst nightmare. The first sound isn't the thunder of a colossus, it's a metallic whistle that cuts through the valley and tightens the chest. The German patrol looks in the same direction, fingers gripping cold rifle stocks, and a brief flash reveals the low, agile silhouette, as if the terrain itself had spawned a beast of steel. It's not the giant that advances, crushing everything. It's the presence that appears where it shouldn't, that shifts position before the mind can complete a thought. What happens to a group's morale when the enemy seems to multiply by its speed? When force isn't announced with weight, but with rhythm? In the early years of the war, the doctrine shaping the German imagination still accepted a simple hierarchy: thick armor, bigger gun, direct impact. But war, that cruel laboratory, always exposes an irony. Sometimes the smaller undoes the certainty of the larger. The Americans understood something that sounded almost heretical to those expecting a frontal clash. Speed is persuasion, ubiquity is psychological pressure. Light tanks, especially in reconnaissance and scouting roles, transformed the map into a living chessboard. And later, when agile models armed with a 75mm cannon emerged, the message became even clearer. You don't need to be huge to be decisive. The effect wasn't measured only in casualties, but in hijacked attention, sustained anxiety, sleep broken by noises that might just be the wind. Symbols govern the psyche more than things themselves, Carl Jung would say in Man and His Symbols. For troops who learn to fear what they cannot see, the enemy light tank becomes a symbol of omnipresence. Where is it? Where did it pass? How many are there? And, above all, how do they appear so quickly from a flank that seemed secure? The symbol displaces internal energy. What, seen up close, is a machine with relatively thin steel, seen from afar and heard in the dark, transforms into a figure that amplifies fear. In the language of psychology and alchemy, it's the moment of nigredo, a darkening of the operational spirit when the soldier realizes the mental map has failed and old confidence no longer covers the reality on the ground. A trench letter, a sergeant writes to his brother, records with simplicity. We don't hear them like the heavy ones, they just glide. Before we know it, they're past the wall. They fire, disappear. The commander says we can't chase ghosts. The term ghosts isn't casual. In the unconscious, according to Jung, what appears and disappears quickly often gains numinous qualities, fascination and dread. Fascination captures the gaze, dread paralyzes decision. And the troops learn, the hard way, that the answer isn't to hunt the shadow, it's to redesign the action. Close passages, check secondary routes, train the ear to distinguish the cadence of light tracks from the rumble of heavy vehicles. This is where albedo begins, the clearing of thought in the face of threat, when technique and humility meet. Historically, the American deployment of light tanks went through phases. Initially, lighter vehicles armed with smaller guns performed contact, reconnaissance, and escort functions. They were advanced eyes, not fists seeking duels. But the battlefield changes fast, and the pressure for more versatile weapons, capable of both seeing and wounding, grew. When American units brought more modern and better armed models to the front lines, combining mobility with the punch of a 75mm, the adversary's perception was rewritten. It was no longer just a scout. It was a scout that, upon finding you, could force you to retreat. For those on the other side, this mixture created a peculiar type of helplessness. How do you set an ambush if the target sees first and shoots with enough force? How do you maintain cohesive morale if the feeling of being pursued comes from the flank, not the front? The scene repeats in drenched forests and stone villages. A German squad adjusts positions, believing they've deduced the line of advance, and then two flashes appear where there shouldn't be anything. The sound is sharp, the response mechanical and quick. In seconds, there's no certainty whether it's a single vehicle with excellent radio support or an entire section splitting angles and covering exits. This technical detail, constant communication and fluid coordination, is part of the psychological terror. The lightness that operates within a network of information creates the feeling that you're not facing anger, but an intention. And intention is something the psyche grasps before reason. They know where we are. Statistics, even approximate ones, help translate the mood. American industry pushed time forward with continuous production, spare parts, abundant fuel, crews trained for movement. The German on the line feels this not as numbers, but as rhythm. If one retreats, another appears. If one is damaged, the next arrives before the dust settles. The adversary's abundance also becomes a symbol that your margin of error has shrunk. In many accounts, technical humility comes late, after unnecessary losses trying to contest, with dual strategies, what requires containment intelligence. The lesson hurts, but it's clear. Against something that moves better than you, to survive is to deny the impulse to chase and accept the discipline of concealment, of measured fire, of the damp patience the forest imposes. Jung would remind us, the collective shadow isn't just what one hates in the enemy, it's what one refuses to see in oneself. The Germany of that time prided itself on engineering, precision, steel. But the shadow whispered a blind spot. The worship of monumental form can dull sensitivity to dance, to improvisation. When an enemy light tank breaks your prediction, the first blow isn't to the hull, it's to belief. The question, always present, who are we when war doesn't respect our favorite way of fighting? There are individuals who emerge from this contact diminished, withdrawn by fear. Others, curiously, grow. These are the ones who accept that individuation, in the Jungian sense, demands integration of the opposite. The methodical learns to move with resourceful improvisation. The bold learns to break, to breathe. On the edge of a dirt road, a corporal comments quietly, "If it were the heavy one, I'd stay put. But this one doesn't stop. It seems to think." The anthropomorphism reveals the deep dynamic. We attribute minds to machines that surprise us. The machine with a mind is an ancient myth, and war reenacts it at high voltage. By projecting intention onto the vehicle, the troops prepare their own collapse, because they fight a hyper-competent presence that, in reality, is a group of men and procedures. Symbolic healing begins when someone brings the myth back to earth. It doesn't think, they communicate well. Cover this street, listen to the radio, don't waste your shot. If it shows up, take a step back and call in the artillery. Undoing the spell is this act of deconstruction. In alchemical terms, the work moves from blackness to a beginning of clarity, in which the monstrous figure returns to its elements: steel, fuel, man. In the harsh winter, nights prolong fears, dreams of sounds. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes compensatory dreams. If during the day the battalion boasts invulnerability, at night the unconscious installs scenes of pursuit and delay. The light tank transformed into a serpent of steel. It doesn't confront you head-on, it slips through cracks. Compensates daily arrogance with nocturnal humility. You don't control everything. Upon waking, the wisest note the dream as instruction, not curse. They review routines, reinforce listening, change refueling times, establish short, silent signals. Each small adjustment returns a piece of agency, and agency on the front is the opposite of panic. Historical evolution weighs heavily. Near the end, when more modern and well-armed versions of light tanks entered the scene, the irony bit harder. What once seemed a mere scout now struck with respect. For the exhausted Germans, with broken supply lines and a hostile sky, the novelty arrived as both sword and whisper. They don't just find you, they push you. In more than one village, the civilian population noticed first. Brief noise, low contour, clean deck, and wondered who was in charge of the world when the light dictated the pace to the heavy. Public perception fed the soldier's perception. Comments, rumors, fantasies proliferated. And troop psychology became a domain of maintenance as important as oil and ammunition. To individuate in war, a reflective officer would note, is to admit fear and transform it into a rule of conduct. The phrase echoes Jung. Individuation does not exclude the shadow, it metabolizes it. In practical terms, recognizing that the light, fast enemy forces you to think with your whole body. Advance less, see more. Break the habit of frontal heroism in favor of the intelligence of tactical delay. Paradoxically, this containment preserves lives and maintains unit cohesion, which regains belief in itself not because it defeated the myth, but because it understood it. The light tank remains a real danger. What changes is your relationship with it. There's still a dimension few admit: envy. Envy of the adversary who achieves much with less weight, who balances simplicity and power. Jung would say that envy is the shadow of repressed admiration. By recognizing this admiration, strangely, respect is born. And respect, in war, is a path to realism. The enemy ceases to be a ghost and returns to being human with a machine. Calculation improves. The creed of invincibility gives way to discipline. To individuate in war, a reflective officer would note, is to admit fear and transform it into a rule of conduct. The phrase echoes Jung. Individuation does not exclude the shadow, it metabolizes it. In practical terms, recognizing that the light, fast enemy forces you to think with your whole body. Advance less, see more. Break the habit of frontal heroism in favor of the intelligence of tactical delay. Paradoxically, this containment preserves lives and maintains unit cohesion, which regains belief in itself not because it defeated the myth, but because it understood it. The light tank remains a real danger. What changes is your relationship with it. There's still a dimension few admit: envy. Envy of the adversary who achieves much with less weight, who balances simplicity and power. Jung would say that envy is the shadow of repressed admiration. By recognizing this admiration, strangely, respect is born. And respect, in war, is a path to realism. The enemy ceases to be a ghost and returns to being human with a machine. Calculation improves. The creed of invincibility gives way to discipline. The troop that crosses this psychic threshold becomes more dangerous and more likely to survive. When morning breaks and the fog lifts, the small valley shows track marks crossing the frozen mud. The silence that follows the combat carries echoes of the noise that isn't forgotten. The men breathe, count casualties, exchange water. Someone comments that there seemed to be 2 vehicles, but perhaps it was just one changing positions with irritating speed. The doubt persists like a metallic taste in the mouth. Later, reconstructing the contact, a corporal remarks, "We weren't slow, we were predictable." It's a phrase that applies to both the map and the soul. If war is the stage where certainties go to die, maturity is learning from their funerals. Thus, part 1 of this journey, the first encounter, the shock, the irony of the light that weighs heavily, places upon the German mind the task of reinterpreting everything. What was firm becomes a question. What was a rule becomes a hypothesis. And under the pressure of time and steel, men discover that surviving isn't just enduring, it's thinking with fear at the table, looking the symbol in the eyes and restoring it to proportion. From here, the story proceeds in a raw, more lucid way. The chronological development of tactics, survival accounts, the adaptations that become necessary when one accepts what the enemy teaches. Because, deep down, that's the uncomfortable secret. Sometimes the other, the hard way, gives you the key to your own maturation. It wasn't a decision made in assembly, it was a reflexive gesture. After the first contact, the German section stopped looking straight ahead and started listening to the flanks. The manual still taught them to look for robust silhouettes on the horizon, but the body learned another grammar. Shallow marks in the mud, minimal variations in noise, a persistent dust in a spot where no one imagined danger. The younger ones began to memorize distances by sound, quietly repeating the cadence that differentiated a slow wait from a compact speed. Fear, once associated with frontal impact, descended to the ankle, to the side of the leg, as if danger were a breath entering through a poorly closed door. And in this intimate, almost invisible adjustment, the development that would change the mood of battalions was born. Attention migrated from the spectacle to the detail. In the desert and later in the hills, encounters with American light tanks taught the rhythm of scarcity and abundance in alternating doses. There were days when they appeared like mirages, eyes that see first, and days when they were the precise wedge that pushed an entire position. In 1942, the Tunisian dust shrouded everything in a sandy twilight. It wasn't the weight that frightened, it was the choreography with the infantry, the fluid communication, the insistence on returning through the same gap the patrol thought it had closed. The psychological effect accumulated by repetition. When the mind associates a sound with a consequence, a bridge forms on which panic travels faster than judgment. Jung would remind us, when speaking of the shadow, that what we refuse to integrate within ourselves returns masked. The light adversary returned to the troops their own rigidity, and this rigidity, wounded, responded with anxiety. Night conversations grew shorter. In low tones, someone would ask, "How many were there?" And another would reply, "Just one who knows where to aim." Sergeants, more than officers, became unnamed psychologists. They repeated gestures that were also rituals against superstition, keeping radios clear, distributing firing fields at angles, training for a brief retreat at the first enemy shot to confuse the opponent's aim. In a practical pedagogy reminiscent of the alchemical stages described by Jung in Psychology and Alchemy. First, nigredo, the confusion, the feeling that one's own doctrine weighed like dark iron. Then albedo, the clearing that comes when the unit produces a new habit, when intelligent repetition cleans the soot of fright. In some platoons, rubedo happened almost like an epiphany. The emotional energy that once fueled rumors began to sustain coordination. They weren't just encounters, they were survivals. One rainy afternoon, a German section was crossing a drenched orchard when two short flashes cut through the mist from a secondary road. The radio warned seconds late because the signals were garbled, and the confusion made 3 men dive behind the same log. The commander, a soft-spoken lieutenant, didn't shout orders. He simply said, "Breathe, 2 steps, break right, don't look for a hero." The phrase rescued the group from the automatic gesture of pursuit. While instinct wanted to run toward the flash, the mind, educated in a few months, understood that it was necessary to turn the tables, fall back a bit, redraw the angle, invite the enemy to believe they had an advantage. When the light tank reappeared, fast, to finish the job, it found a narrower field of fire and an anti-tank gun that didn't aim at the hull, but at the belief that the spot was empty. The shot didn't destroy, it immobilized. That was enough for the section to get out intact. The day's report noted minimal casualties and a maximum lesson. Against what is fast, the first ally is the silence that thinks. There was also envy, an ugly word no one liked to admit. Jung would say that envy is the shadow of repressed admiration, and it was hard not to admire the purposeful lightness, the communication that seemed to stitch American units together with an invisible thread, the habit of exploiting any opening as if the terrain were always in their favor. In more than one field diary, the same confession appears. They aren't big, they are many, not in number, but in their way of repeating themselves. Repetition with variation, like a myth returning with a different face. German psychology, accustomed to trusting the design of steel, now needed to trust the design of listening. Instead of waiting for the roar that announced the beast, they learned to fear the shift in wind that betrayed the thief. The chronological development took a sharp turn when, in late 1944, more low-profile American light tanks with 75mm cannons and a smoother ride appeared in greater numbers. From a distance, the impression didn't match the fright they caused up close. The round turret moved naturally, and the recoil seemed designed to complement aiming precision. The suspension absorbed irregularities, allowing for irritating stability when firing on the move. On narrow village roads where the Germans expected the enemy to slow down, the machine kept going, almost as if it didn't even feel the stone. The symbol of speed with punch became explicit. For crews who had faced older versions, the comparison was a blow to pride. Where before there was an almost certain chance of forcing a retreat, now there was the humiliation of being pushed back by the light one that also wounds. The adversary's material abundance affected the soul as much as its technical resources. In cold terms, it meant fuel whenever needed, spare parts on time, crews replaced before extreme exhaustion. In hot terms, that became the feeling that the enemy would always have one more light tank around. It was unfair, of course, and the tired mind translates injustice into magic. They appear out of nowhere. The antidote was painful and simple, recognizing the harsh realism of an opponent who organizes logistics better. The humility born of this recognition has the color of albedo, the clearing that isn't resignation, it's method. The units that embraced this realism traded performative heroism for patient intelligence. They survived more. Don't chase the sound became a rule. Chasing the noise was falling into the opponent's game, who seemed to emerge from the flank precisely because they wanted to lure pursuit. Instead, radios began to operate in a short, almost telegraphic cadence. Corner check, 2 seconds. Response, 1 step. Pause. Compulsive shooting gave way to studied fire, and even the infantry learned a kind of meditation in motion, measuring their own impulse, seeing the body's relief when breath commanded more than anger. Jung spoke in Man and His Symbols of the power of daily rituals as bridges between conscious and unconscious. The ritual of the short retreat, the ritual of 10 seconds of silence, the ritual of the rotated position generated another emotional texture. Less blind urgency, more intention. In a small town crumbled by bombardments, 4 Germans held an anti-tank gun in the corner of a ruined church. The smell of dust, candle wax, and oil mixed like a perverse incense. The American light tank crossed the main street twice, each time from a different angle. There were 2, maybe 3, it was hard to tell, because their rotation and communication created the illusion of a larger presence. The gunner, hands damp, repeated to himself, "It's not a monster, it's a man with a machine." The phrase, learned in improvised psychological instruction sessions, worked like an amulet. When the enemy reappeared, they didn't aim at the fear that screams, "Shoot now." They aimed at the opponent's habit, at the predictable attempt to break through a blind spot that no longer existed. The shot hit it as the turret began to sweep the corner. There was no cinematic explosion. There was immobility and a brief puff of smoke. They got out alive, and one commented, exhausted, that the biggest victory wasn't stopping the machine, it was stopping their own fantasy about it. The evolution of perceptions in these months seems like an accelerated course in individuation. The nervous young man who in the first week unloaded ammunition into the dark became the soldier who counts to 3 before acting. The proud veteran who used to laugh at tin cans scurrying around came to respect the art of the armed light tank. The unit that fawned over magical solutions traded tricks for processes. And with each small gain in realism, the shadow lost a bit of its paralyzing power. The shadow didn't vanish, it never does, but it stopped commanding. And when the shadow stops commanding, the soldier begins to feel something akin to freedom, even in a scenario that denies the very idea of choice. In the midst of this hard-won learning, there was a brief pause for the narrator's voice that accompanies this story. If this deep dive helps you understand the invisible layers of war, not just machines, but symbols, fears, and choices, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos and share it with someone interested in psychology and history. We return to the field because that's where the lesson springs forth. Survival stories gained sensory contours that the mind doesn't forget. A corporal described the cold in his teeth he felt biting the bullet of fear when he heard the scratching of tracks very close, like nails on iron. Another recounted that the sight of a light tank crossing a shallow creek without hesitation became a symbol that they don't get stuck where we get stuck. These micro-scenes function like daydreams, images that condense meaning. Jung taught us to read them. The creek is the symbolic limit, and crossing it without drama is the message that humbles and instructs. The world resists less when you understand it. The healing process of a platoon involved rewriting these internal images. If before the light tank was the beast that prowled by night, now it became an object of study. Studying the enemy is the most honest way to demagnetize it. It didn't always work out. There were silent collapses. Men who started shooting at the wind because the wind sounded like tracks. There were those who, at the first metallic snap, closed their eyes for a second, and a second there was enough to lose everything else. More attentive companions began to observe these signs and create, with what they had, a kind of safety net. The partner who puts a hand on a shoulder before a crossing. The leader who takes the first corner for the nervous one to regain composure. The improvised rule of never letting someone who slept poorly take the radio. Practical psychology, plain and simple. War doesn't wait for a therapist's office, but humans always find a way to care for themselves. Closer to the cruelest winter, reports of encounters with the newer models, low-slung, smooth riding with steady fire, multiplied the feeling that the opponent's time ran a little faster. It was an illusion, and it was true. Illusion because no one runs in the mud without paying a price. True because the machine designed for it pays less. The German, cornered by all the shortages, felt the moral weight of fighting against those who seemed born ready for the terrain. Envy began to lurk again, and with it, cynicism. The only vaccine was honesty. In a terse note, an officer wrote, "Admit the other's merit or fear them twice." The phrase circulated among units like a useful shame. And then came an episode that many recounted as if it were a local myth. In a narrow valley, two light tanks advanced in a zigzag, swapping positions with a cadence that seemed like music. A German observer, sheltered on a ridge, noticed that the leaps were too regular, like dance steps. He noted the rhythm on paper and marked the moment when one's cover would leave the other side exposed for a gray second. It was still possible to miss, of course. But now there was a second that wasn't witchcraft. It was geometry. When the moment arrived, the gun fired, and the valley silenced the rumor for a fraction of the world. It wasn't that the dance had been defeated. It was understood. The soldier folded the paper and whispered a thank you to no one in particular. Individuation, sometimes, is a folded piece of paper. At the end of this chronological block, the result is the oscillation between fear and method, between symbol and steel. The American light tank, especially in its more mature form that brought a respectable cannon to an agile body, captured the adversary's attention beyond what its weight would suggest. It was not a dead-end hypnosis. It was a process of forced education. The German troops, when they survived it, returned different, less enamored with their own image, more aware that war rewards those who engage with reality. Jung was not in the trenches, but his insights illuminate the internal corridors through which an army passes from fright to lucidity. And if the story from here moves to the point where the symbol catches fire, the climax where numbers and myths face final fatigue, it will be because the path was prepared by these months of small corrections. Where the light enemy taught, without asking permission, that no weight compensates for a lack of listening. Those who are in these positions rarely speak of victory with shining eyes. They speak of survival with a strange respect.
The possible healing isn't to forget the American light tank, it's to remember without trembling, to have the hull's outline in the mind without turning the hull into an ogre. This healing wasn't completed in everyone, nor did it need to be. Enough for the remaining units to cross the finish line with some dignity, clinging to the simple idea that courage is the human name for integration. Us and our fear, together, looking at the same noise without lying to ourselves about it. The flash that tears through the dawn doesn't ask permission. It splits the soul in half, and for a full second, no one is a soldier, just a body grasping for air. The first impact hits a stone wall and returns a trembling echo, as if the village gasped in fright. The platoon holds its impulse. The noise that follows isn't heavy, it's smooth, a rustle of tracks with a patient pulse, as if the steel had learned to float over the pavement. The street is narrow, the smoke low, the smell of cold soup mixes with oil. The clock seems to stop. The American light tank appears and disappears as if the landscape itself produced it. The turret turns naturally, the antenna vibrates, the low hull cuts shadows. It's not a colossus, it's an insistent presence that turns a corner before the mind completes a thought. What kind of machine is this that weighs little and yet bends time from within? The sergeant doesn't order in advance. He orders them to listen. The verb, so simple, reorients the scene that so often ended in haste and loss. In Man and His Symbols, Jung writes that the symbol mediates sensation and word. The order to listen transforms diffuse threat into something nameable: cadence, blind spot, repetition. The light tank doesn't think, but its crew thinks for the machine, and that intention leaks through sound. The turret turns in short cycles, the engine holds its breath, releases, holds again, the track bites and yields to the stone with the same step. Someone whispers, "It's not everywhere, it's in the same place in different ways." The phrase cleanses a bit of the spell. The symbol begins to yield to interpretation. The statistics that matter there don't fit into staff reports. They are measures of breath. How many seconds a man can hold fire.
How many steps a unit retreats without losing its axis. How many times the adversary repeats the same line before trusting it too much. Far away, spreadsheets count ships, hulls, cannons, gasoline. Here, the arithmetic is intimate. 2 extra breaths become survival. A rhythm noted on a crumpled paper turns into a key. 10 seconds of silence preserves cohesion. The other's lightness stops seeming like a miracle when someone draws in the mud the curve it insists on making. It's less witchcraft, more habit, and habit can be predicted. The climax builds when a dry crack reveals the enemy section changed position for the 3rd time following the same curve. The corporal, hands cold, repeats the lesson. Don't face it where it wants. Lure it into the void you've prepared. The void is a blind intersection, 2 walled-off doors and a sloping street that pretends to be an exit. At the first reappearance, no one moves. At the second, the infantry takes half a step and retreats, leaving a minimal trace of distraction. The tank takes the bait. On the 3rd pass, the gun waits for the tiny instant when the turret begins to sweep the corner and the side exposes, for a gray second, the weakness of the whole. The shot doesn't produce a spectacle. It produces immobility, a hiccup of smoke, a grinding of metal that disregards its own weight. The silence that follows isn't glory, it's a sigh of someone who survived by understanding a pattern. Emotions, however, don't obey clocks. Half the group exhales relief. One man freezes, eyes fixed on the memory of another night when the same sound ended in fire. The sergeant touches his shoulder without words. The touch is a bridge. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung describes the transmutation of the raw into symbolic gold. Here, the gold is the ability to remain whole, to see fear as a consultant, not as a tyrant. The freezing subsides. The hand returns to feel the trigger without urgency. The mind resumes the map. There is space, finally, for reason to return without expelling dread. Integrate, don't deny. The shadow remains seated in the corner, but no longer holds the steering wheel. There is irony in both grandeur and smallness. Lightness doesn't win by being light. It wins when it communicates with supply, radio, and infantry that knows what it wants. The adversary's abundance is perceived as rhythm, not as numbers. If one retreats, another takes over. If a piece fails, another is ready. If the plan goes wrong, communication cuts corners. On the German side, fatigue and supply breakdowns force shortcuts, and shortcuts feed the enemy's game. Where there's a shortcut, the light tank seems like a demon. Where there's method, it becomes a machine with men inside again. And when the group accepts that fast is almost always well coordinated, superstition loses its grip. The fierce symbol becomes a procedure that can be read. The body registers every lesson. Cold trickles down the nape of the neck. Skin collects dust from freshly wounded brick. Ears hold ricochets like tin ghosts. Eyes burn with stubborn smoke. The metallic taste in the mouth isn't blood, it's air cut by something fast. Fingers tremble not from the weight of the weapon, but from the interval between hearing and deciding. And in the midst of the whole body, a thread of lucidity asks, what exactly do I fear now? The machine, the noise, or the image I make of them? The question doesn't ward off danger, it wards off hypnosis. The psyche, taught to name, reclaims inches of ground. Field individuation begins by recognizing the face of fear. Reports of overcoming in this phase avoid adjectives. One man says he stopped dreaming of the tank when he started drawing its silhouette on paper every afternoon, as if staring the beast in the eyes stole its spell. Another confesses he crossed an open street repeating like a mantra, "It's not a monster, it's a pattern." A third admits he was saved by a comrade's laugh, a short laugh that brought the body back to the present. Laughing at the wrong time is the trickster's function, an archetype that disarms rigidities and brings play back to the mind. Jung would remind us that without humor, consciousness hardens and breaks. Grace doesn't deny pain, it manufactures oxygen. And with oxygen, the mind sees the enemy's line better. Not everything is a hit. One day the light tank returns along an unforeseen route and strikes a corner of a wall where two men were. A void remains in the formation with a remembered name and laugh. Anger calls for revenge. Method calls for containment. The sergeant chooses containment. The choice hurts like a knife. It hurts and saves. The unit doesn't fall apart. It mends the fabric, closes the street of temptation, grieves without becoming prey. Jung would say that the shadow desires shortcuts and instant purities. Integrating it is denying its command and hearing the message. You don't control everything. This humility, bitter, is the beginning of wisdom. The enemy remains dangerous. The mind, however, regains a vocabulary for danger. In the collective unconscious of the group, the light tank is no longer a hypnotic serpent. It's a subject of study. The culture absorbs short sayings, "Don't chase the sound," "Count the rhythm," "Let fear teach," and transforms these sayings into muscle memory. The almost beautiful irony is to note that the very movement that humiliated now instructs. Where the machine passes, clues remain. Shallow marks, forced silence, a pole cut at the wrong height, a persistent smell of fuel. The enemy teaches the terrain to those who accept being students. Accepting is half the victory, because it gives the mind the key to the labyrinth. And when the labyrinth has a map, the night remains dark, but loses the property of being confused with infinity. Hey, since you're walking with me at this turning point, if this journey helps you see how symbols and procedures meet at the nerve of history, comment what you think and tell me in the comments where you're from. This conversation keeps the human thread alive amidst the iron. If it makes sense, share it with someone who needs to hear this now. Now we return to the valley, because the dust hasn't settled yet and the clock insists on moving faster than the lungs. Morning breaks and the platoon executes the transition that separates improvisation from routine. The radio speaks in shorter phrases. The two best shooters only fire with double confirmation. Steps obey the lungs, not anxiety. The surviving light tank rotates its turret like someone hunting for a mistake. The mistake doesn't come. A short retreat, a new angle, a humble barricade of broken furniture. It insists because its function is to insist. By insisting, it represents the pattern the group has learned to read. The gun waits for the tiny instant when the hull enters the corridor and, for a breath of the world, loses flank cover. The shot is sharp, without heroism. The machine retreats with jolts, alive but less in command of the scene. No shouts, just breathing. And a realization. More than winning, today was about learning not to lose. The central point of this transformation isn't to destroy the adversary, it's to dissolve the fantasy that made it omnipotent. Fantasy served fear, and fear saved lives, until the moment it started deciding on its own. When fear commands, it wastes ammunition, breaks lines, isolates people. When it advises, the lightness on the other side is not so much material as organizational. It appears as an intelligence that insists, a habit that repeats the essential without tiring. Morale doesn't collapse all at once. It fades in zones, like neighborhoods of a city in blackout, and each faded zone demands the thread of dignity back. The final phase of the theme unfolds in practice. No longer is the question asked if the light tank frightens. The question is how long it can dictate time and space before night imposes another rule. The command, more realistic, accepts that enemy surprise is not a mystical entity, but a product of coordination and terrain reading. The response, therefore, shifts to what is still possible: delay, harass, deny the most obvious road, preserve personnel. It is on this ground that psychology weighs like an unwritten weapon. With each short incursion of agile armor, a unit that has learned to breathe with dread responds with economy. A shot that holds, a retreat that avoids collapse, a sabotaged bridge that doesn't become a spectacle, just a few more minutes. Minutes at this stage are worth more than trophies. Stories reappear like resilient seeds. In a stone village beneath a cracked bell tower, a group of 8 men holds a side street for hours that felt like glass. Slowly, any extra weight breaks everything. The low-hulled, lively turreted American light tank practices S-entries, sniffs out angles, talks to someone who isn't there. The group learned to count this invisible dialogue and decides that attacking isn't winning, it's getting lost. When the push comes from the rear, anticipated by the geometry of habit, they don't fire celebratory shots. They wait for the gray second when the two machines swap roles and one side breathes unguarded. It is there, without fanfare, that an improvised gun plays its part in the silence. There is no complete victory. There is a postponed passage, and the population has time to cross the back bridge. Heroes without applause, just men who accepted that the last service is to buy time. The influence on the larger course of events is perceived in the small details. An advance that arrives less whole, a column that needs to detour, an additional night to remove the wounded. Morale, wounded for months, perceives the value of these small things and relearns to measure itself by criteria more human than slogans. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes how entire cultures depend on the stories they tell about themselves. There, in the end, the internal narrative that saves is not one of invincibility, but of composure. The troops stop promising miracles to their own pride and start promising decency to their own memory. This changes the smell of the air. It doesn't eliminate material defeat, but it demands that it not completely devour the soul. There are scenes that hurt in their simplicity. A corporal collects the crumpled drawing he used to note the rhythm of 2 tanks, putting it in his pocket as if it were a family photograph. He says as he leaves that he wants to remember when the head started commanding the arm again. This phrase is an intimate legacy, the recollection of an instant when the symbol lost its tyranny and perception gained substance. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung speaks of the work to red, the rubedo, in which something finally acquires integrated heat, life, and meaning. What this corporal carries is not victory over the machine, it is victory against the delusion that turns every machine into an invincible beast. Is it small? It is immense in what matters to the human spirit. On the other side, American lightness proceeds with its logic. Reconnaissance that turns into a flank, flank that turns into a push, push that turns into localized surrender. The figure of the light tank, which began as an advanced eye, matures into a hand that pushes at the right times. The accumulated effect on the German mind isn't hysterical despair, it's lucid exhaustion. The body learns it can survive without needing to win every appearance, as long as it doesn't chase ghosts. Local command, more sober, abandons the dogmas that demanded grandiose answers to small questions. And it's curious, almost ironic to note how, at the end of the line, individuation flourishes in minimal gestures, a non-shot, a measured step, a disciplined silence. At this point, an explicit connection to Jung is fitting. The collective shadow, technical pride, the fantasy of control, and an allergy to improvisation, doesn't evaporate. It learns to sit at the table. The individuation that matters here is that of units that integrate opposites, coldness and compassion, discipline and elasticity, recognition of another's merit without capitulation of one's own value. In Man and His Symbols, the dialogue between conscious and unconscious occurs through images. In the field, it occurs through procedures. Procedure is embodied image. The ritual of checking the wind before a crossing, the mental count before firing, the rule of never chasing the sound are, in practice, operational myths that keep the psyche in the right place. Perhaps the deepest mark of the legacy lies precisely in the humility learned. Later, many would confess that they came to respect light machines, not for their specifications, but for their dialogue with the terrain and with logistics. This respect travels with the survivors. In future workshops and schools, the lesson translates into doctrine, valuing coordination, brief communication, sensory reading of the environment. The best American light tank, best not in abstract grandeur, but in its historical fit of mobility and sufficient firepower, left more than wrecks in its wake. It left a mirror. And the image in that mirror was bitter and useful. Purposeful speed almost always wins over the rhetoric of size. It's a lesson that crosses borders and decades, because it speaks to the structure of the human, not just to engineering. The impact on morale doesn't end with fanfare. It ends with a kind of dignified silence. There are unavoidable losses, broken destinies, maps scarred with wounds. And yet, breathing shallowly, a unit can still say, "We did what was humanly possible." In the Jungian lexicon, this is enough integration to avoid cynicism or denial. There is no painted glory. There is a painting in shades of gray that, paradoxically, sustains truth. Truth allows for honest grief and a less distorted memory. And it is from a less distorted memory that societies are born, less inclined to fall for the siren song of machines that promise ready-made identity. If this deep dive so far helps you see how the end of a campaign doesn't erase psychic lessons, strength and limit, symbol and steel, pride and humility, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion, and share it with someone who needs to think about history beyond the noise. When night finally falls, the men who remain line up equipment with a care that isn't obsessive. It's salvation. Someone cleans a scope. Another smells the canvas, as if confirming the world through his nose. There's an almost domestic meticulousness that offends promises of glory, and it's precisely this care that prevents the soul from deteriorating. The light tank, far away, continues to converse on the radio with its operational family. Here, the response is the commitment not to let the other's presence dictate one's own dignity. The course of events, too grand for human hands, will follow its precipice. But, in pockets, papers with arrows survive. In eyes, learned angles survive. And in hearts, the understanding that war, when it becomes a teacher, charges dearly and delivers dearly. It teaches that courage isn't a shout, it's the breath that reconciles fear with what still needs to be done. The next morning brings no redemption, it brings clarity. The valley displays its seams, track marks scored like musical staffs, soot in predictable curves, broken shop windows pointing to the side from which the fright came. The unit walks slowly, collecting what cannot be left behind. Wounded, memories, papers with arrows. The American light tank remains a real threat, but it no longer occupies the king's chair in anyone's mind. The human impact appears in small things. The hand that trembles less when adjusting the sight. The step that doesn't chase the noise. The gaze that seeks the wind before the corner. And the industrial impact, silent and ubiquitous, is in what the mind learned the hard way. It's not just the steel, it's the chain that feeds it. It's the continuous conversation of the parts. War, when it finishes teaching, doesn't give final exams. It leaves scars in the form of procedure. In later reports, figures summarize what the body knows in another way. Quantities indicating how mobility, communication, and constant maintenance transformed light vehicles into multipliers of presence. But for those who were there, the numbers are cold translations of a very specific heat. The sensation of being hunted by something that didn't need to crush to win. It just needed to arrive first and force the other to dance to the wrong rhythm. The psychological legacy is the learning of breath. No doctrine can sustain itself without the lung that executes it. And in Jung's language, the journey through the alchemical phases, the nigredo of dread that darkens judgment, the albedo of method that clarifies action, the rubedo that restores warmth and meaning to action, ceases to be a literary metaphor and becomes a routine of survival. The memory of those who return doesn't romanticize. It speaks of the smell of fuel on hands for weeks, of hearing that takes time to detach from the sound of tracks, of the reflex that still seeks flanks at any intersection of civilian life. It also speaks of a new respect, almost humble, for what moves with clear intention and patient coordination. The best American light tank, best in the concrete measure of its fit between mobility and sufficient firepower in its time, became a pedagogical figure. For adversaries, it taught them to renounce the cult of monumental form when it distances itself from the terrain and rhythm. For those who employed it, it taught them not to confuse logistical ease with moral invulnerability. Because power that organizes well risks believing that the world is its natural continuation, and it is not. The shadow on each side remains seated, asking for its place, reminding us that no machine, however fast, absolves men of the weight of what they do with it. There are final statistics that matter more for what they imply than for what they highlight. Columns that had to divert, bridges that gained minutes, positions that didn't fall on the day they would have. On a saturated front, minutes are destiny, and every minute snatched from the clock there was paid for by people who traded grandiloquence for composure. It is the least photogenic and most necessary virtue of war. The industrial impact persists as a horizon. In the post-war, factories and schools will absorb the lesson into doctrines, tables, and manuals, the primacy of terrain reading, laconic and reliable communication, maintenance as daily faith. The human impact follows another road. The man who returns and teaches his children to listen before accelerating, to measure before shouting, to distrust size sold as a solution for everything. When silence finally outweighs noise, the remaining unit sits on the ground and accepts the inventory of the soul. Those who lost someone write the name on the inside of their helmet. Those who lost no one write a gratitude they cannot voice. Someone quietly quotes a line from Jung, remembered secondhand, that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. There, the darkness had the sound of tracks, the smell of oil, disciplined speed. Making it conscious was the only way not to live at the mercy of its suggestion. Individuation, a grand word, became small and domestic. Counting to 3, listening to the radio, refusing irrational pursuit, respecting what works, admitting what fails. The conclusion doesn't fit in fanfares. It fits in a harsh understanding. There is no clean triumph in a lesson learned late.
But there is dignity in having learned it. The American light tank will remain in books as an example of how organized efficiency can redesign a battlefield. In hearts, it will remain as a mirror that forced another army to recognize its shadows and, by integrating them to some extent, to save what could still be saved, not victory, but the minimal humanity of gestures. And this, though it seems little, is what prevents defeat from turning into cynicism and success into arrogance. If this conclusion made you think beyond the steel, if it touched something about how symbols govern fears and how methods rescue people, comment here what you think about it. Tell me in the comments where you're from and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Here, history isn't a parade of machines, it's a field where the human soul stubbornly tries to remain whole. In the end, the figures settle and a final image remains. A low hull disappearing behind a curve, not as a ghost, but as an understood phenomenon. The impactful phrase someone writes on the cracked wall of the destroyed school becomes both epitaph and advice. Speed beats size, but only consciousness beats fear. It is poor as literature, it is rich as a rule for life. Because every war, even one that ends, continues within. And the only armistice that matters is the one in which the mind, having faced its shadow, signs with its own hand that it will not surrender command to panic, nor to the vanity of confusing power with destiny.